3rd of January 1993. A motor tanker sets sail from Northern Europe on its way to Canada. On board is a full cargo of 85,000 tons of light crude oil. Apart from the crew, there is also a technical superintendent on board. He represents the ship managers and is here to get the ship ready for an inspection later in the year. Southerly winds of Storm Force 10 are forecast for Sea Area Viking. The plan is to sail south of Shetland through the North Fair Isle Strait. The master is taking this route to avoid the more severe weather conditions north of Shetland. On the 4th of January, shortly after 0900 hours, the second officer and the chief engineer noticed that the storm has caused 4 pipe sections to break loose from their racks. Because the vessel is pitching heavily and frequently shipping water, the second officer and chief engineer do not go out to inspect the deck. The pipes are made of steel, each about 5 meters in length. The lengths of piping have been welded to fabricated racks on the port side of the after deck, but they are now rolling between the engine casing and the ship's port rails.
Yes, coming in.
At 0920 hours, the second officer reports the loose pipes to the master. The master says that they will have to wait for the weather to subside before anything can be done about them.
People to secure at present time, this is fine. We were waiting, improving weather condition, and we'll see what we will do.
Roger, sir.
Thank you.
При возвращении с бака мной было обнаружено на корме.
When I returned to the foredeck, I stopped because I noticed there was a pipe on the deck which was no longer secure.
Каталась по палубе.
They were now rolling on the deck.
Мною были приняты меры. Я
I felt that something should be done and informed the mate.
второму помощнику, который был на вахте,
I was assured that he would take the necessary precautions and that I could go.
что будут приняты меры соответственно. Я ему
During the day, a severe gale continues to blow from the south, causing the vessel to pitch and roll.
80.
At 0940 hours, the chief engineer also makes a report about the loose pipes to the master and the superintendent.
Mate, good evening.
The master takes no action other than checking the weather forecast. That evening at 1930 hours, the auxiliary steam boiler trips out. The third engineer resets the switch and starts the boiler again. After half an hour, the boiler has returned to its usual pressure. On handing over the watch at 2000 hours, the third engineer tells the second engineer that everything is running normally. On the bridge, the master discusses the route and the weather with his third officer. No mention is made of either the boiler trips or the loose pipes. At 2030 hours, the boiler alarm sounds. There is a flame failure. And when the second engineer tries to start the boiler, it will no longer fire up. He informs the chief engineer that the boiler is not firing properly and asks permission to change from fuel to diesel oil. The chief engineer agrees to this
Good night.
and goes to bed. At midnight on the 5th of January, the second engineer investigates the boiler failure. He decides to disconnect the coupling and the fuel line to the boiler and discovers that the fuel is contaminated with salt water.
While working in the machine room, I noticed that the boiler alarm was frequently activated. Nobody really seemed to notice, and nothing was done about it. After the boiler stopped working, we noticed that there was water in the fuel tanks. When the alarm was raised and nobody did anything to rectify the problem in the beginning when they should have, it was now much harder to fix.
At 0200 hours, the superintendent leaves the master's cabin and decides to visit the engine room before going to bed. The second engineer tells the superintendent that because of a problem with the boiler, they have changed to diesel oil. He also reports the fact that the fuel is contaminated. The superintendent asks for the chief engineer to be called to the engine room.
Hello?
The chief engineer arrives in the engine room at 0230 hours. He now takes charge, asking for the fuel line to be disconnected so that he can check the contamination for himself. He tastes a sample of the water and finds it to be salty. He then goes to the diesel oil settling tank, opens the drain valve, and sees a mixture of water and oil. On opening the diesel oil service tank, similar contamination is found. At 0330, the chief engineer tells the motorman on watch to start draining the diesel oil, settling and service tanks, and to continue draining them until uncontaminated diesel oil appears. Meanwhile, the superintendent and the second engineer work on the boiler. The ship is now entering the Fair Isle Channel, 7 miles south of Sombra Head. By 0400, the diesel oil has not settled out the water due to the rolling of the vessel, and the superintendent leaves the engine room to go and wake up the master. At 0410 hours, the superintendent reports the difficulties with the diesel oil to the master. He says there is water in the diesel tanks and that it is necessary to anchor the vessel in order to drain them fully. In the evening, after my working day was over, I was going to throw out some garbage. I went out on the deck where the garbage pails are, and there was very bad weather and big waves. I heard a banging sound and noticed that a pipe was rolling on the deck and that it could cause damage to the ship. But I did nothing about it because I figured it wasn't any of my business, and that those whose responsibility it was were probably taking care of the situation. That's why I told nobody about it. Thought that it wasn't necessary. That's all I've got to say. The superintendent and the master go to the bridge and consult the charts to identify a suitable anchorage. At 0436, course is altered towards the Murray Firth, some 100 miles to the southwest. Only 4 minutes later, at 0440 hours, the main engine slows and then stops. 2 minutes later, the generator stops, resulting in a loss of all main power. At this point, the ship is 10 miles south of Sombra Head, and there is still a severe southerly gale. At 0515 hours, the superintendent makes a link call to the ship manager in the United States. He explains the situation and tells him that the vessel will need tug assistance. The ship manager says he will contact the underwriters and call the superintendent back. The ship is drifting towards Sambra Head at about 2 knots. At 0548, the master calls the Coast Guard to arrange a tug. Through a combination of language difficulties and poor radio reception, the Coast Guard interprets the master's request as an inquiry about the price of a tug, and not a definite confirmation that towage assistance is needed. At 0600 hours, the ship is 6 miles south of Sambra Head. It is the Coast Guard who now orders a tug and a helicopter. The helicopter arrives on the scene at 0640 and starts to evacuate the crew. When the tug arrives, attempts are made to pass a line to the ship, but these fail. At 11:19 hours on the morning of the 5th of January, a large wave lifts the ship's stern and it lands heavily on the rocks at Garth's Ness, northwest of Sambra Head. Everyone is safely rescued, but the entire cargo of oil spills into the sea.